Very good to be here. I was just thinking about what to say, because in general, one advantage of going early in a conference on a common theme is that there's less risk then that you've been scooped by somebody else. And imagine then my dismay when I was listening to Dave, and I was going to say that, I was going to say the other. Some things will be familiar. There's just, but before I turn to anything on the handout, so here's a general sort of inspiration underlying thing. So it's sort of undeniable that there's sort of some interesting work that goes properly under the heading of conceptual engineering. Individual discussions of cases, such as Sally's discussions of woman, Kevin Sharp's work on truth, etc. Maybe, as Dave was talking about, lots and lots of work in philosophy over the years can in some sense be seen as conceptual engineering. Even if that's so, it's not obviously a great idea to have like conferences and anthologies and stuff on conceptual engineering, because it's not obvious that there is the kind of coherent, unified project there, such that you can say sort of interesting general things about them. Maybe there just isn't enough commonality between, say, what Sally is doing and what Kevin is doing in order for this sort of thing to be justified. And I think, without going into details about the kinds of projects that I will not be talking about in my talk, I think that part of what's going on now in the work on quote-unquote conceptual engineering is sort of people are in different ways looking around for different sorts of possibly interesting general projects that fit under that heading. And then we'll sort of see which projects turn out to be interesting and which projects turn out not to be so interesting. And part of what I'm going to do now is to, after some general remarks, which will be partly familiar, I will talk about the sorts of things that I find really interesting and that I think are in some sense unified and fit under the heading of conceptual engineering. Okay, so section 1 from the handout. So let me first just quote from the call for papers for this very conference. Another dimension of cognitive success is using the right concepts, i.e. framing a topic in the right way. This view, if correct, tasks inquirers with critically examining the concepts they're using and perhaps replacing those concepts with new and better ones. This task is often known as conceptual engineering. And then comes a list of bullet points, specific questions. What are the semantic mechanisms that underlie conceptual engineering? What are concepts, and which role, if any, do they play in conceptual engineering? How can a theory of conceptual engineering be integrated with large-scale semantic theories? Which precise changes does a language undergo when its speakers engineer concepts? Is conceptual engineering something that speakers can ever purposefully bring about? What is the relation between changing concepts and changing reality? One main focus here is on the practical question, the kind of activism question of actually changing which concepts we use. And I think we can distinguish 3 different broadly conceptual engineering related projects. One is what I call the prescriptive project of sort of, well, maybe activism would be a better label, in fact, sort of reforming which concepts are employing when, and thus reform, for example, how some theorizing is actually done. That's prescriptive. Evaluative project, so it's just evaluate concepts and their appropriateness for different purposes. You can say, well, this concept is good for this purpose and less good for that other purpose, and so on and so forth. And thirdly, there's a mapping project, just to provide an inventory of what sorts of concepts of various kinds that there are. Now, some of the general discussion of conceptual engineering, for example, in Herman's work, concerns the sort of feasibility of the prescriptive or activism project, even given sort of very radical skepticism regarding that project. Clearly, the other projects in principle remain. You can still sensibly evaluate concepts. And if you think that that project too, the evaluative project, is somehow misguided, maybe you think for whatever reason that talking about concepts is good or bad to begin with is kind of misguided for this, that, or the other reason, the mapping project remains. Now, one we keep using the label conceptual engineering. Another label used, for example, in David Plunkett's and Alexis Burgess's work is conceptual ethics. Some of this is maybe more properly called conceptual ethics. Maybe conceptual engineering could be reserved for something like the prescriptive or activism project. Another quote, not now from the call for papers for this conference, but from Nietzsche. This is actually from the, this is also quoted in the introduction to the Burgess-Plunkett-Capellan anthology, From Will to Power. What dawns on philosophers last of all, they must no longer accept concepts as a gift, nor merely purify and polish them, but first make and create them, present them and make them convincing. Hitherto, one has generally trusted one's concepts as if they were a wonderful dowry from some sort of wonderland. But they are, after all, the inheritance from our most remote, most foolish, as well as most intelligent ancestors. What is needed above all is an absolute skepticism toward all inherited concepts. Now, notice here how evaluative and prescriptive issues get intertwined. There's on the one hand the kind of exhortation to sort of make and create and change and so on. Then there's separately, but sort of intertwined, there's a point about the attitude that we should take toward our concepts. And even if certain kinds of conceptual changes are impossible, having a different attitude towards the concepts that we use, not looking at them as a wonderful dowry, etc., could be a kind of healthy thing. I mean, suppose that we have good reason to be skeptical of the actual concept woman, but the prescriptive project is impossible, no changes can be made. It can be sort of in some sense good to sort of have a different, sort of just different attitude toward the concept that we're for whatever reason actually stuck with. And similarly in the case of truth. Okay, so a general thing that I think is a kind of good piece of advice is called on the handout the general CE advice, CE for conceptual engineering or conceptual ethics. Question whether actual concepts really are the best for purposes at hand. Also question our purposes. What other possible concepts are there, and how do they compare to the concepts that we use? Which concepts are best for which purposes is one kind of question. Another question is, well, maybe some purposes that we have are not great ones to have in the first place. We should rethink those as well. Now, and going back to my very first remarks before I even turn to the handout, the general CE advice should arguably be seen as sort of uncontroversial or trivial in many cases, and nothing to sort of build big research. Yeah, good, maybe good to think about, but nothing necessarily to build research projects around. What has interested me in different ways, even before people started sort of generally using the label conceptual engineering, has in effect been the possibility of alternatives to philosophically central concepts, and that of sort of, in some sense, questioning philosophically central concepts. So I did work on arguing, like Kevin has later argued, that the concept of truth is inconsistent. I did not at all sort of think it in terms of prescriptive or activism issues when thinking about that, because I was at the time thinking that was just this kind of, it's silly for philosophers to try to sort of make people sort of think and talk a particular way. Whether or not that was sort of the right stance, that was the stance I had, and even given that stance, it can be a good thing to think about, well, what are the features of that kind of concept? What are the, possibly, what are the alternatives to that kind of concept? And in fact, I think thinking back to what I was thinking when doing the relevant work, I was really interested not so much in even the evaluative project, but more the mapping project. I was interested in, well, can there be such things as, in some sense, inconsistent concepts? What might they be? How can we make room for them? And then it was a completely separate question. Are they good? Are they bad? Should we revise them? Later, I've been interested in sort of meta-ontology, where one debate in meta-ontology concerns quantifier variance, which in one of its incarnations is the idea that there are different existence concepts and none of them is privileged over all others. So that's So there you have kind of evaluative theses about concepts and about again, a kind of very fundamental concept. And even if it's easy enough, so to speak, to engineer and think about new concepts when it comes to sort of obviously technical things like supervenience, say, it becomes much harder, perhaps, or more interesting in some ways, to think about the possibility of sort of engineering and coming up with alternatives to concepts when it comes to the very most fundamental concepts. And I will talk about some other examples later. So that's it by way of just distinguishing between some different conceptual engineering related projects. Second topic, continuity. So in some of the recent literature on conceptual engineering, the issue of continuity between the new concepts and the old ones which they're supposed to replace has been sort of an important issue, and it's been seen as a kind of potential problem for the conceptual engineering project. So Herman, in his book Fixing Language, is concerned with continuity and asking the question seen as kind of troublesome question for the conceptual engineer. Haven't we changed the topic in some problematic way? We started with some questions, now we've sort of introduced some new concepts, and so we've somehow lost the questions on the way. I'll give a more proper characterization soon. In a recent paper, Michael Prinzing describes the objection as follows. A common charge faced by conceptual engineers is they don't advance their respective debates because they merely change the subject. If you change a concept, this objection claims, then you equivocate and fail to address the pertinent issue. Now, obviously, this only applies to things that fall in the general kind of re-engineering category and not in the sort of complete de novo engineering category. Herman raises the problem. That's not to say that he thinks that in the end it's a lethal one. He has a response. It is to appeal to a suitably liberal notion of saying the same as, and a suitably liberal notion of sameness of topic. So even if a concept has undergone changes in extension or intension, the topic can count as being the same, and hence the problem is in the end averted. But what I'm concerned with is not whether there's a solution to the supposed problem, but what the supposed problem is supposed to be to begin with. I fail to see the force of the worry. So what if I change the subject or don't address the same issue as before? I thought that was the point. I thought that the idea was that we framed things in the wrong way, that we should then sort of replace the old questions with new ones rather than just trying to address the old questions. So somewhat more carefully, changing the subject is not itself a bad thing. It depends on what the aim is. And so here's a bunch of quoted passages illustrating what I'm talking about. I'm not going to read them all, just focusing on some of them. So first, Herman from Fixing Language. Suppose someone tries to improve on the meaning of belief or woman, and as a result changes the extension of the word. Now suppose we try to answer the questions that we formulated using those words pre-amelioration, using the words with new extensions, i.e. we respond with sentences like women are and belief is. The objection is that the answers employing terms with the new extensions fail to answer the original questions. These answers concern something new, not what we were originally talking about when we used the expressions woman and belief. We have the illusion of an answer, but it's a purely verbal illusion. There's a lack of continuity of inquiry. The old questions are not being answered. We're answering new questions. Okay, so again, Herman has a response to this, but he sees it as a significant challenge. So several chapters of the book are devoted to this topic. And then, let me see. Maybe let me just turn down to Strauss. So all the passages are made. I'm going to make the same point about all these passages. So let me just move down to Strauss and have that as my only other example. To offer formal explanations of key terms of scientific theories to one who seeks philosophical illumination of essential concepts of non-scientific discourse is to do something utterly irrelevant. It's a sheer misunderstanding, like offering a textbook on physiology to someone who says with a sigh, that he wished he understood the workings of the human heart. Typical philosophical problems about the concepts used in non-scientific discourse cannot be solved by laying down the rules of exact and fruitful concepts in science. To do this last is not to solve the typical philosophical problem, but to change the subject. And this is, fairly sort of famous passage from Strauss and Hermann when he brings up the kind of concern about conceptual engineering, even like calls it the kind of Straussian challenge. And in each case here, the structure is if we want to illuminate some ordinary concepts or the properties or relations they stand for, or if we want to answer some specific questions asked using the old concepts, then we cannot make do with simply using the revised concepts, for then we've left the subject behind. But if our aim is precisely to change the subject, to replace the old questions with new ones, then that's hardly any kind of concern to begin with at all. Okay, so. And of course, sometimes you may have the more conservative aim of sort of answering exactly the old questions, but I think lots of conceptual engineering, even things that sort of would fall on the re-engineering rather than the de novo side, would fall on the side of, well, who cares if we're exactly doing the old thing? The important thing is that the new question is a good question to ask. Okay, so what I've done so far is, I started with a sort of preamble saying, well, what's the point of asking general sort of questions about conceptual engineering, even if this sort of thing is very sort of ubiquitous in philosophy. It does not mean that there's kind of, in any sense, unified thing here to ask questions about what's the point of sort of this particular angle on philosophical questions. Then I distinguished these different sorts of projects, prescriptive, evaluative, and mapping, and I emphasized that even if we were to set the prescriptive project aside, there are these other projects that would remain and would in principle remain significant. And then I sort of made some negative remark on the supposed problem of kind of continuity, the supposed Straussian challenge. What I'm going to be doing for the second half of the talk is something sort of completely different. It's to sort of give some examples of things that I see as interesting and falling under the heading of conceptual engineering, and emphasizing particularly their sort of relationship to the general sort of Nietzschean sentiment, if you like. And the examples I'm going to give are two. First, I'm going to briefly talk about something where sort of I don't have anything very specific to say. I think these are sort of really cool issues, but if people want to help me out making them more precise, I'm happy. But then secondly, I'm going to talk about some stuff from my recent book, Choosing Normative Concepts, where sort of I hopefully have some more definite things to say in some sense. So the first example to for the first time relate to the title of the talk, Unfettered Conceptual Engineering. Unfettered in the sense we don't care at all about the sort of continuity stuff. Alien linguistic structure. So if you're interested in, well, already the mapping project, then you might wonder, well, what are there possible languages that are just structurally, fundamentally unlike familiar languages? They don't use anything like singular terms or predicates or quantification. The substantial expressions play completely different roles. There's no neat mapping at all between one such language and one of our languages. So what would be the point of thinking about such an alien language? Well, I mean, metaphysicians have been interested in the fundamental structure of reality, thinking that maybe the fundamental structure of reality is very different from how we commonsensically think about reality. Maybe the fundamental structure of reality is such that you need sort of a language with this kind of alien structure in order properly to capture the fundamental structure of reality. Here, the very point of engaging in this kind of thought experiment about whether this kind of thing might be possible is thinking that something radically different might be required for the perspicuous representation of reality or fundamental aspects thereof. And any kind of demand for continuity is kind of obviously and sort of boringly sort of misplaced here. Similarly, even given that maybe that you're generally positive about the prospects of a prescriptive project, maybe the idea that we could start using one of these alien structure languages, if such there be, is kind of, well, that's kind of beside the point. The important thing is that we can talk, we can talk about them. This is how we would need to talk if we were to describe the fundamental structure of reality. Okay, so that's kind of a kind of just metaphysics illustration of, well, here are the sorts of things that ought to occur to you. The possibility of alien linguistic structure like this when you're sort of in the Nietzschean mindset, so to speak, in the mindset of the passage that I read of thinking that, well, the concepts that we do have, the representational machinery that we do have is just what we happen to have. There are lots and lots of different possible concepts or representational systems out there. Let's see what the limits are. And of course, I mean, what I just now said speculatively and without any sort of concrete example might be sort of fundamentally misguided, and that someone might say that, well, wait a minute, there are sort of facts about the fundamental structure of reality of sort of language or representation or concepts which just force any possible language representational system to have something like the familiar structure, so that sort of there can't be completely alien representational categories. The representational categories are to be found among the familiar ones in some sense. If so, that's an interesting conclusion of another kind. That's kind of we're still doing the mapping project. So we're still looking at what kinds of possible concepts there are. And we've then figured out that the kinds of concepts that are sort of, well, fewer than might have been sort of dreamt of by some philosopher. Okay, so that's one possible sort of example, metaphysics. Now, about something that I have discussed at more length, the normative. And let me begin talking about the normative in the following kind of way. So many sort of structurally different theories of normative thought and language have been defended by different theorists. There are various non-naturalist and naturalist cognitivist theories. There's prescriptivism, expressivism, various hybrid theories, and so on. And we may imagine that sort of the debate over how actual normative thought and language works eventually yields that, oh, these and these guys were right. The others were wrong. Okay. Even so, even if some particular theory is right of our normative thought and talk, some other community can be such that some different theory of how normative thought and talk works can be true of how they think and speak when they think and speak normatively. And one might wonder, given that there are such possibilities, might there in principle be reasons to favor their ways of thinking and speaking about the normative? There are two different questions here. I should immediately say to ward off any misunderstanding. One is, so to speak, the question of which possible normative concepts best limit the structure of normative reality. Which ones are the ones that sort of correspond to what, sort of, that in some sense best capture what normative reality is like. That's very metaphorical. I hope that what I've gone to say will help. Second is, which normative concepts are all things considered best to actually use? And these two questions might come apart. And sort of consequentialist theories provide an example of this. It may be that sort of, well, consequentialism in some very sort of deep sense gets the normative right, but even so, for consequentialist reasons, there may be some other concepts that are in fact consequentialistically speaking best to use. And what I'm interested in is the kind of the first of the two questions, not the practical question in which sense by the consequentialist lights non-consequentialist concepts might be best, but the sense in which it's kind of trivial that by sort of hardcore consequentialist lights, consequentialist concepts are the best. Some different possibilities. Maybe expressivism is true of our language, so if we study the way that we normatively think and talk, expressivism gets things right. But if some other community were to, so to speak, try to talk about some non-natural normative properties out there, they would succeed. It's just that we've been sort of more modest. We don't try to talk about that part of reality. I mean, it's possible. And then there's a question, well, sort of, are we missing out in some way? Or sort of, or even if there are these properties out there for them to talk about, maybe we're sort of in some sense still doing absolutely fine and not talking about those properties. Or maybe, sort of, even if we are speaking cognitivistically, other communities might speak expressivistically. The question, well, what does that mean that we have an advantage over them? There are some ways of presenting this that would make it sort of seem as if the advantage is obviously on the sort of on the cognitivist side. Look, if there are these normative properties out there, then if you're sort of engaged in normative thought and talk and you're not talking about them, then you're clearly missing out when it comes to normative stuff. But that, how much that really means depends on what do you mean by normative property. If normative property is just a fancy expression for property picked out by some piece of normative language, then there's no obvious advantage in talking about normative properties in that sense. Another possible thing is that, well, cognitivism of some kind is true of our normative thought and talk. We talk about some particular properties when we are using words like right and good and so on. But some other possible community uses words with similar roles to ours in the sense of sort of guiding action and so on. But they're talking about properties too. Cognitivism is true about their kind of thought and talk too, but they're talking about different properties. In each of these cases, a natural sort of thing to sort of ask oneself is, well, who gets things right? We or them? And one way of, well, continuing now to section 5 here. So these should seem like eminently reasonable questions to ask. It would be a silly dogmatism to think that we've gotten things right. I mean, recall sort of Nietzsche, we shouldn't think of our concepts as some sort of wonderful dowry. And one way to bring home the seeming reasonableness of these questions is, well, focus on this last kind of case I talked about. We are cognitivists, they are cognitivists, they're talking about different properties. And imagine that by our lights, that they're picking out such properties by their normative talk that they're behaving just abominably. Okay. If it's they then have in some sense latched on to the wrong concepts for normative reasons, and if it's possible for them to have latched on to the wrong concepts, why think that we are immune to having gone astray in the same way? Okay. At the same time, of course, if this has now sort of struck people already, what the heck are we asking? Because when we're trying to ask this seemingly perfectly reasonable question, there's us, we have these concepts, there's them, they have their concepts. There's a choice to be made, which concepts use, and we're trying to ask, well, which concepts are better? Which ones ought we to use? Then we're using, broadly speaking, normative concepts and trying to ask that question. So what exactly is going on there? I can speak more or less metaphorically in terms of limiting the normative structure of reality, but that doesn't actually solve any kind of sort of issue. At best, it helps to sort of disguise it and help you get into the sort of spirit of things. One possibility, of course, is then to say that, well, all the facts are that, well, maybe our concepts are the best ones in the sense of our best, and some other concepts are the quote-unquote best ones in the sense of some other quote-unquote best. We can, so to speak, pat ourselves on the back by sort of saying to ourselves, and using our resources, our concepts are the best concepts. Some other community can correspondingly pat themselves on the back. And then but that's all there is to it. There is no, so to speak, further question here. Okay. Now, I don't even in the book have a kind of settled view on the matter of whether there is a further question. I think that one can't blithely dismiss the supposed further question. Intuitively, we can certainly imagine other communities getting tragically wrong, as I said, but if they can, why can't we? And maybe one useful sort of analogy here is with Quine on indeterminacy. When he brings up the indeterminacy problems using the issue of translation and another community and it being sort of indeterminate what they mean by terms, it's because it's much easier to getting a handle on the supposed question of indeterminacy when thinking about some other language. And then he brings things home by saying, well, if that can happen to them and they are in the same situation as us, then that can happen to us too. Moreover, I think that many of us have a kind of deep-seated sense of, well, reality favors certain actions over others. That's a kind of sort of metaphorical way of putting a certain kind of motivation behind realism. But without the further question, if all the facts are that our concepts are by their lights the best, and if their concepts are by their lights the best, and there is no further question, then we've seemed to have lost that particular motivation behind realism, even assuming that the realist gets, so to speak, all the facts about our normative language right. We pick out properties, it's objective, they're objective facts about which things have these properties and so on. And just to quickly wrap up here, because maybe my time is up, the way in which this generally ties in with the motivations for conceptual engineering is that sort of thinking about sort of things in the sort of Nietzsche will to power passage spirit. You see sort of, well, even when it comes to our most sort of fundamental basic concepts, good, right, thought, or sort of, well, it's hard to imagine what alternatives to them could be. Well, maybe there still could be, and maybe it's just a kind of limitation of us if we can't sort of vividly imagine, if we can, so to speak, vividly imagine this. But the questions that sort of one can raise by considering these alternatives sheds light on general philosophical discussion about normative matters. Thanks.
Seven, 8, 9. Everybody has a number? Okay. Great.
Okay. Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question about what you said at the beginning, about the relation between what you call the prescriptive project, or what you also call the activism thing, and the evaluative project. But it seems to me that a certain view, a certain skepticism about the activism part has consequences also for the evaluative part. Because if you think that actually changing a concept or changing what a word means is possible or close to impossible, then isn't theorizing about what concepts should mean to a large extent just a waste of time or some idle theorizing that should really take a lot of room in philosophy?
So what I was thinking is that suppose that we're I'm just trying to sort of think of a new sort of different example. Suppose that I come to think that talk of justice or individual rights is just a kind of that sort of carries a lot of sort of ideology with it that I don't want to buy into. So I think these are sort of maybe I think that sort of there's a certain kind of sort of liberalism that's sort of involved in them, and I'm not that kind of liberal. I'm just making this up now. And then I also come to think that, well, I can't actually sort of change it. I can't change what I mean by these things. I can't change what other people mean. I can still both sort of engage in a kind of sort of therapy for myself, so to speak, of sort of, well, yeah, even if I keep using just, I can still sort of keep telling myself, well, this does not actually have the importance that I might have thought that it had before. I can still do that, and by sort of by writing my book, sort of criticizing the kinds of presuppositions underlying talk of justice or individual rights, I can get other people in the same mindset. So even if I can't make them change what concepts they use, I can change the way in which they think about the concepts that they're using. And that might be sort of, well, it may not have be everything that I could possibly hope for, but I don't think it's sort of terrible either.
10?
Oh, no, sorry, it's 8.
Yeah, you got the number 10.
I know, probably 10.
Two.
Alright, yeah. Just a really small question about the last part of the talk, when you talk about, and we discussed the second example of normative concept. So I was not exactly sure how many of the issues are distinctive to normative concepts, and in fact, many of them seems to be very natural counterparts to descriptive concept. To take, for example, the situation where you have two linguistic communities, one uses the word belief and the one uses the word croyance, and it just happens to pick out properties which are just not the same, or mental states which are just not the same, but somewhat not too far from one another, right? You may think, for example, that the functional properties that's picked out by belief and the functional properties that's picked out by croyance are not exactly the same, but they're really related. It seems to be exactly the same. You seem to be exactly in the same situation as the one you described in your example, where right and correct, for example, would be picking out distinct but related properties. So I'm not exactly sure how much is distinctive here to the normative.
Great. So I'm not. I don't think I'm sort of committed to distinctiveness. But let me say. So suppose that we have some theoretical case, maybe sort of belief and croyance, and we have different communities of speakers, sort of using one or the other. Then, I mean, for all that's been said, when we've just talked about things that way, it could be that those communities of speakers have other vocabulary by means of which to settle their differences of one kind or another. In the very simplest kind, they have the same sort of descriptive theoretical vocabulary. They both agree as that, well, that's the best vocabulary, and then they think that, well, oh, and if that's the best vocabulary, then one can, using that vocabulary, give an argument for sort of one or other of the sort of belief-like things. But that's one kind of thing. More importantly, perhaps, maybe in some sense, all of this sort of, even if what I said about the normative may generalize, insofar as it does, it's because these other questions too are normative. When you're asking about sort of, well, belief or croyance, you're asking, well, ought we to use one or the other? And then sort of it goes back to the norms. One thing actually that I'm sort of thinking about, although largely unsuccessfully, is whether there are sort of cases that are sort of different from the normative in the way that they don't sort of go back to the normative in the way that I just thought that this case might, but which still display the same structure. I'm not saying that there aren't any such cases, but I think it's at least very hard to sort of see how there could be these cases that display the structure that I've said is at issue in the case of normative, but which still are sort of different and don't in any way go back to the normative. Then, I mean, there's of course a separate question of, I mean, the way that I find it natural to think about things is that, well, there are these kinds of all-purpose, general, all things considered, ought and right and so on, that everything sort of goes back to in the end. I don't have any argument for thinking about things that way. Some kind of pluralism at the bottom of the normative, so to speak, might be sort of more reasonable, and there's a kind of distinctive theoretical ought and a distinctive practical ought, and we should keep them separate, and then we have separate kinds of issues, but still the structure is going to be the same, and it's going to be normative in some sense.
Herman has something on
Just
that.
like, isn't truth a good candidate for a similar structured case where there's this other community uses truth in a different way from us, and then now there are these questions about truth that will involve truth? Or is there some difference there?
So I agree that truth is a good case for something where you have something like the same sense of what's going on as in the normative case. But is it non-normative? I actually planned originally to include truth as well, sort of in giving the top, and then I thought it would all sort of degenerate into bad Trump jokes and things, so I sort of didn't talk about alternative facts and alternative notions of truth. But there too, I mean, if you're using one notion of truth and I'm using another, why doesn't that equally go back to the normative, so to speak? And we're asking, well, ought we to use this this
Is it
notion
truth
of truth?
that we ought to?
Yeah, is it truth or truth prime that we ought to be using, and whatever. So,
Number 3, I forgot who it was.
Okay.
Okay.
I mostly wanted to ask about continuity, and in some sense, this you mentioned a fundamental concept, like some concepts, maybe like goodness, are more fundamental. And I guess I was just wondering, maybe if that would be the key, would kind of, keep the continuity with the fundamental concepts, but then do more engineering with maybe some of the other ones. And I guess I wondered whether to do this, whether natural science and social science might have different. Like I was thinking, as far as the, being able to state that one scientific theory is an improvement, or somehow better describe it. Like those seem to require, talking about the same concept to be able to refute, a prior theory, or to be able to kind of say, hey, this is an improvement. Whereas, in social science, there might be some sense that, and I really like this phrase, that we might have like an obligation to kind of the prior, the way we talked about maybe race or gender or something. And I guess I just wonder whether there is this difference. And I kind of want to conclude with maybe a little Nietzschean spirit. If these fundamental concepts are something like goodness, he's going to say something like, well, the people that originally had the power, they were the one coining these words or, establishing these concepts. Maybe even something like goodness, was something like, hey, what is goodness? Well, goodness is what we are. We're the powerful. Let's claim that goodness is a reflection of us. So I guess I wonder, if that's the case, do we even have to engineer these fundamental concepts like goodness?
So I'm not sure I follow, because I mean, what you said first, when you probably I'm just going to end up sort of asking you sort of restate the question.
Okay,
You should first describe my confusion. What you said first was that maybe we can sort of revise the less fundamental concepts, but then keep the fundamental concepts.
That might keep, continuity.
That might keep continuity. And when you said that, I was sort of thinking, well, that might keep continuity, but why? Because, well, can't we, shouldn't we try to think about sort of what might be problematic about our most fundamental concepts too, in the way that I myself sort of started doing toward the end of the talk. But then you yourself, when asking the questions, sort of raised that, and then I got confused about what you were sort of asking. Can you try again to?
Well, I guess the question is, if you go that route where fundamental concepts are the way to keep some sort of continuity, are you then subject to that final critique that I tried to make, which is like, hey, even these fundamental ones need to be reevaluated in some way, because they were originally, established by people either with power or certain kinds of, agendas.
So what if I simply say, that we should be sort of thinking about that and reevaluating?
That's good.
Number 4.
That was me. So this is a question about the Strawson's challenge. So I was super sympathetic to the stuff you said there, and I think there are a lot of things that can be said about it. But I wasn't totally satisfied that your observation that the aim is to change the subject, so it's not a problem that we change the subject. I wasn't satisfied that just made the problem go away. So, I mean, one way to see it is there's a big difference between saying like, well, I don't think you should be asking questions about truth. I think you should be asking questions about upward truth and downward truth. And saying, I don't think you should be asking questions about truth. I think you should be asking questions about the upcoming Emmys broadcast. So there's a big difference between those two. What is the difference? Well, in some sense, the first one is in the neighborhood of the original question, or it gets at the issues that got us interested in the original question in the first place. So something like that. I'm saying things that are kind of vague. One way to understand Strawson's question is as a challenge to get precise about what you mean by the neighborhood, or what exactly are those original interests that got you interested. So I was just curious if you thought there was a need to say something about that, or do you really think none of that is necessary?
I guess what I think is, there's not going to be any kind of once and for all answer to what's in the neighborhood. I mean, it's going to be a sort of just issue. Well, just what? I mean, setting aside the further complication that one might sort of question the original aims and purposes to begin with. That's just noise for present purposes. In every case, it's going to depend on just what the original aim is. I mean, if the sort of original aim is just sort of something very sort of generally couched, like sort of just thinking about, well, whatever is the most important thing to do or to be concerned with. And I started thinking that it was truth, and then I might end up sort of thinking, oh, it's something completely different. It's not even upward truth, but it's something just fundamental. It's pleasure, or whatever. Sometimes I may have more sometimes I may have more specific aims, like, well, what might be the central notion in a particular kind of semantic theory? And then it would be there will be certain ways of going wrong that wouldn't have been ways of going wrong if I'd begun with the very first question. So, and typically, this kind of what aims we have are sort of being presupposed in such a way that certain alternative new concepts come to seem as perfectly sort of ridiculous for sort of that purpose. But even in any such case, I think, well, can't we imagine in principle certain aims such that that replacement could in principle make sense?
So would it be right to say that you're skeptical that there's going to be anything very general to say about?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you.
I have a very similar question. So, let's say the original question is, do we know anything about the external world? And then the conceptual engineer thinks that's not a very interesting question. The question we ought to be asking is, do we know star anything about the external world when no star, let's say, some Bayesian replacement probability of knowledge? Okay, I like that as a reply to the continuity objection, but then this is related to the point about the neighborhood. Then you say, in each case, the structure is, if we want to illuminate some ordinary concepts, then we cannot make do with revised concepts, and then you go on. If our aim is precisely to change the subject, then the antecedent isn't true. But I would have thought that the antecedent has to be true in some sense. So in order to get to the place where we think that the question, do we know star or anything about the external world, is the important one to ask, we already have to have interrogated the ordinary notion of knowledge, or at least convinced ourselves that it's not the same as knowledge star. Or we have to somehow convince ourselves that, yeah, this is not. We know enough about knowledge to know that this is not the question we should be asking. We should be asking this different questions. So I don't think you can completely avoid illuminating the ordinary concept.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just. I think I'm just happy sort of taking that point. I mean, I think that, but there's a difference between sort of my sort of being, I don't know whether this suffices to sort of defend the letter of what I was saying on the handout, but I was thinking that there's a difference between my main aim being to ask some question or answer some question framed using the concept knowledge, etc., and my sort of aim being sufficiently related that my getting clear on knowledge is still sort of relevant to satisfying that aim. And what you're asking precisely sort of illustrates that difference. And I'm sure, certainly sort of in many or maybe sort of all cases, it's going to be it's going to be still relevant to find out.
Number 6. Maybe that was here.
Sorry. I'm kind of mystified by the kind of skeptical worry you're trying to get us gripped by there towards the end. So let me try to see if I'm stating the worry right. The worry is, there's one kind of skeptical worry I'm not mystified by. I'm not mystified by someone who wonders, oh, maybe the things we think we have most reason to do, the things we think we ought to do, all things considered, are not in fact things we ought to do, all things considered, but rather we ought to be doing other things all things. Fine with that. I'm also open to somebody says, oh, maybe all things considered, we shouldn't be talking about what we should do, all things considered. Or maybe all things considered, we should stop talking about that altogether, and all things considered, we should never use the words all things considered. But you seem to be trying to get me on board for the following worry. The following very recondite worry. No, fine. I'm not worried. Yeah, sure. You're pretty much right about what you should all things considered do these lovely, nice things and so forth. And you should consider also. You should also all things considered, continue to do ethics and to investigate what you all things considered. But hang on. What if reality wants you to do? What's your thing going again here? What if reality itself favors something totally different? Reality itself favors maybe hitting yourself in the head with a hammer all the time or something. To which I don't know what it would mean for reality itself to favor something other than doing what you all considered. If it did, I wouldn't care. I'm tempted to sort of cash it out, given some of the stuff you said about limiting structure and stuff. You know, maybe hitting yourself on the hammer is a more natural property or something like that. I mean, probably being negatively charged is more natural. And you can imagine a community that's like utilitarians for negative, they're like trying to maximize this negative charge in the world or something like that. In that sense, if that's what you mean by reality favors maximizing negative charge, the fact that it just doesn't worry me at all, to suppose that it does. It doesn't in any way shape my my happy plan of going around doing that which I all things considered awesome.
So, let me first say what I completely agree with. I agree that the worry that I'm trying to get you to share with me is a really strange one, and you're laying out precisely what's weird and strange about it. Where I don't agree is that it somehow sort of does not make sense. I mean, sort of try to do a bit more to sort of help with the the point, sort of strange though it may be, you should take it seriously. Okay, so suppose, let me do it in two ways. So first, suppose that we have a particular theory, a particular metasemantic theory of, in virtue of what normative expressions like all things considered ought come to sort of stand for what they stand for. And suppose that that metasemantic theory also tells us that, well, certain aspects go into the determination of reference for such things that seem normatively irrelevant. Things like the causal history of the use of the term, or what have you. Then you might think that, well, yeah, it's true that my all things considered applies to these actions, but, well, in some sense, you should want to ask yourself, what is
the sense of should? In what sense?
I mean, that's in the sense my point.
That's my point.
But I mean, maybe this will do another kind of thing to sort of appease you. So, I mean, I want to get to the second thing I wanted to say originally as well, but maybe the strangeness of the question should make us think that the kind of metasemantics which might make us think that this question ought to be a reasonable one, that metasemantics just should be abandoned, so that whatever the way that all things considered ought, it is that all things considered ought works, just rules out that kind of sort of alternative, rules out there being that kind of contamination of potentially sort of irrelevant factors in the determination. And if so, then the question is indeed a bad one. And maybe the view that sort of metasemantics is the correct one is, I think I take that very seriously. I didn't talk about that now, but that's sort of one other sort of theme in that's one other theme in my sort of in the discussion in the book. And then the second thing I wanted to say was, I mean, this does not actually sort of add anything theoretically, but I think that trying to sort of get you sort of in the spirit of things. So suppose that you have the kind of view on all things considered ought that you have, but then there's a different community, as there might consistently be, given the kind of metasemantic views that I talked about before, where they have their expression all things considered ought, and that is true of, or most recent to, or what have you, but their expressions like that are true of different things. So they are sort of happily going about doing other things and setting aside any worries in the way that you are. And I keep thinking that as you sort of as your all things considered odd as, say, sort of deontological, so you never sort of sacrifice innocent children for the benefit of overall happiness, and their all things considered odd is utilitarian, sort of not the greatest example in the grand scheme of things, but good enough for sort of illustrative purposes. Their all things considered odd as utilitarians. Sometimes they sort of do thumbs up to doing that sort of thing. Then there is a sense that there is something at issue between you, and it's not trivially the case that you are right about whatever it is that you are having a disagreement about.
I think we should move on to number 7.
That's me.
Awesome.
Cool. So I'm going to ask you about the same part of the paper, but I think I'm maybe a little more sympathetic to the original worry. All right. So one way that you put a worry, if not the worry, in the talk, and I think again just now, is in terms of discovering a rival linguistic community that also employs normative important talk, superficially similar to our own. And we each ask ourselves the question, whose way of doing normative important talk is best? And we say, hooray, we found out that it was ours. And they also say, hooray, we found out that it was ours. And there's a kind of symmetry there that's supposed to be worrying in some way.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, I totally see how that would be if the best understanding of each linguistic community's normative thought and talk is a non-error theoretic cognitivist one, and we're just picking out different properties. But surely this symmetry would be broken, at least in the case in which the best account of one linguistic community's normative thought and talk is an error theory, and the best account of the other linguistic community's normative thought and talk is a non-error theoretic cognitivist. Because at least we're both trying to refer, and one of us is failing and the other one is succeeding, right? So that might be a way of breaking the symmetry, which also I would note could generalize beyond the normative in the way that philosopher 2 earlier suggested. That it's like, how about that as a positive suggestion?
It would, I think, depend on the supposed reason why an error theory is true. So distinguish. Well, let me first take a different kind of case. So forget error theory. Suppose that instead you have a view on that are properties in the sparse sense and properties in the abundant sense. And instead of error theory, you think that, well, only one community's normative predicates pick out properties in the sparse sense. The other community's properties only exist in the abundant sense. If that is, I'm perfectly aware that that's not what you were exactly asking about. But let me just start with this case. If that's the difference, and if one try to say on the basis of that, well, the symmetry is broken because the community that picks out the sparse properties wins, then I think that's something that I didn't pick up on, but that came up in what Kian asked, and well, why the things that determine whether a property is sparse or abundant aren't the sort of thing that should matter, that should matter for normative purposes. So then, if you hold an error theory, because you think that there just aren't any properties that exist merely in the abundant, and so in the only way in which properties can exist, it's only the sparse properties that exist. If that's the reason why you hold an error theory, then I think that original source of skepticism about this move for breaking the symmetry remains. So that's a long way of saying that, well, error theory by itself does not cut it, at least if the error theory is supposed to hold for this particular reason. Because you hold a particular restricted view on what it is for properties to exist, then it does not help. So it would depend on the reasons for there. If there is a different kind of reason which seems more potentially relevant.
Number 8. Number 9.
Yeah, I think I've number 9.
Okay.
So yeah, very much in the same vein as these other questions. So I'm not sure I can clearly imagine these alternative communities. And I'm thinking of some of what Davidson says about conceptual schemes, right? Possibility of conceptual scheme, the thought being, when I'm thinking of it all like an alien linguistic community, I'm thinking of attributing meanings to them. What I'm doing is trying to give a rationalized interpretation of their behaviors. If I have a certain understanding of what ought means, of what it is to have a normative judgment, developing this interpretation of them is going to involve attributing to them these odd thoughts, right? So if I'm an expressivist about those thoughts, well, okay, then I'm going to be attributing odd thoughts to them, and I'm going to be attributing expressivist ones because that's how odd thinking works, right? So I'm having trouble like envisioning these alternative possibilities.
Okay, so let me sort of divide my answer to that up into, and I think first, if we set aside Davidson and the kind of theoretical sort of framework there and just put it in terms of sort of, it's hard to imagine them. I'm sort of, so long as it's just put at that level, I'm inclined to say something like, well, yeah, I agree it's hard to imagine them, but if we have reasons to think that these things are possible, then we can still reason about them even if we can't imagine. For example, if our theories of how normative language works, if our metasemantic normative language is such that it allows for these differences, and even if it's hard to imagine these other things, well, who cares about that? Then when it comes to the Davidson stuff, I mean, here's, I mean, I brought up, although I didn't sort of actually make use of it, maybe it was more sort of, it was a bad idea to bring out these kind of sort of expressivist versus non-expressivist cases. So focus on a pure cognitivist case. I think that's sort of the best case to think about for the purpose of answering your question. Then, if we are the deontologists, so to speak, and they are the utilitarians, I can in some sense provide an interpretation of their odd. It's not going to be as my odd, it's going to be as, well, sort of maximizes general happiness or what have you. That's what I'm going to sort of translate them, translate their talk into. And then, but that might be sort of, I mean, I'm not that sympathetic to the Davidson stuff to begin with, but even if I'm sort of playing with that, then that might be enough even for the Davidsonian to sort of get things. Okay, then you can say, oh well, they have their term which translates into my language as maximizes general happiness. The way that they use that term is that they are actually using that term to guide action. They are sort of letting that decide how to act. Oops, you can do things that way. That's an alternative way of doing things. Hence, there are questions that arise about sort of, well, us or them, and then we're back into the kind of set of problems that I wanted to get you on board with.
Let's thank our speaker.